Hey, Patricia.
Hello, Kim.
How are you? How was your weekend?
My weekend was alright. I was just chilling at home here. Finally, we have a very nice spring season. We just had the Cherry Blossom Festival last weekend, and I don't know, just been enjoying the warmer weather at home, reading some poetry, and just relaxing. How about you?
Well, that sounds amazing. The Cherry Blossom Festival is so special.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get to go?
No, I didn't. I don't go unless I really plan it ahead of time, but it's usually crowded and I like to go to the Arboretum actually and enjoy the sort of side views of the whole event.
Nice. Well, actually, I wanted to share something that I did a few weeks back, but I haven't shared yet. I tend to keep in touch with people that I do exhibitions with. And Susan Talbot, for example, was the director of the Wadsworth Atheneum when I did my Matrix show. She moved to LA, really close to me, actually, and she invited me to join her and her really cool friends to see the William Kentridge and Phala O and Nhlanhla Mahlangu, and I apologize if I got the name wrong, the performance of The Great Yes and The Great No at the Wallace. I mean, it was an incredible performance. It was about a cargo ship leaving Marseille for Martinique in 1941, escaping Vichy France with André Breton, Claude, Levi, Strauss, and the Cuban artist Wifredo Lam. It turns into a surrealist voyage with the narrator inhabiting Charon, who is the ferryman of the dead. And it was like an arc of sorts, complete with other historic characters, including representatives of anti-colonialism. And again, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, but Amié Césaire?
Amié Césaire.
Yeah, thank you. Frantz Fanon and the Nardal Sisters. And then for some reason, Frida Kahlo and her husband are in there. The whole thing had an eerie similarity to what's going on now. One of the characters said, "I carry a brick to show how beautiful my house once was." That line flattened everybody in the audience. And I thought it was just an incredible performance. It was a really like one of these cool things. Kentridge does this thing where he incorporates music and art and performance, and it's just so cool. Anyway, we have a fascinating guest today, so let's get going. Welcome to The Art Equation.
Welcome to The Art Equation, a podcast from Now Be Here. I'm one of your hosts, Patricia Ortega, and our historian and independent curator.
I'm your other host, Kim Schoenstatt, a contemporary artist and organizer of Now Be Here, a directory of and for women and non-binary artists.
On this podcast, we have a little charla, a little bachipapo about making art and making exhibitions. We invite fellow artists, curators, archivists, and people from different areas of the art world to share their knowledge and their experience.
We are curious about what goes on in the day-to-day of arting. We want to talk shop, get in the weeds about what goes into art shows, talk with the makers and the doers of the art world. Welcome to The Art Equation.
Yes, so today we are sitting down with a fantastic guest that we can't wait to jump into conversation with. Our guest today is Sala Elise Patterson. Sala, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
We'll read a short bio as usual so our listeners can get to know you a little bit.
Great.
Sala Elise Patterson is a researcher and writer of overlooked stories, especially of the African diaspora. A former magazine editor, her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Kinfolk, Vogue, Italia, British Journal of Photography, and the New York Times, where she broke the story of Adrienne Fidelin, the first Black model to appear in a major American fashion magazine. Sala co-authored the entry on Fidelin in the Oxford Dictionary of Caribbean and Afro-Latin American Biographies, and an essay on her in the Musée d'Orsay exhibition catalogue for Les Modèles Noirs de Géricault à Matisse. Sala is a serial expatriate. Benin, Brazil, France, Italy, Japan, Tanzania, Tunisia, United Kingdom. She's been in all these places.
Wow.
She's a linguist who holds a BA from Columbia University in African American Literature and an MS in Development Studies from the School of Oriental and African Study at the University of London. She's a contributor to Harvard Design Magazine, where she writes about design and society. And she's vice chair of the board of trustees of the Phillips Collection here in Washington, D.C. And this is America's first museum of modern art. Or so they call themselves.
Ooh, I love it.
It's such a pleasure to have you, Sala.
Thank you.
This is a very powerful bio. We're so pleased and honored to have you.
Thank you. I really am excited. Thank you for inviting me to be here.
So with this long list of involvements and of experience that you have, we really struggle to find a sort of point of entry into your life and your work. But we did become very interested in your work as a nonfiction writer. And we realized that, working at the intersection of art and cultural criticism, journalism, it's something that sort of reflects in your work. And I was recently reading this book about the work of the American poet Elizabeth Bishop, and it's titled Exchanging Hats. And I was thinking about you and about all of these different hats that you wear as a member of the board at the Phillips, but also working in a myriad of independent projects. So I guess our first question is, do you see all these things as being interconnected? Or do they allow you to use the many different skills and interests that you have?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think in my mind, in my conscious mind, I feel like I keep these worlds very separate. But of course, that's impossible. I mean, these things are porous and I'm one person, right? But I think I assume that I'm drawing on very different sets of skills and sensibilities depending on the role that I'm serving at a given moment. But I think I do try, I think my edge, if you will, in each one of these environments is that I'm not solely of any one. And so what I bring is like this presence as a board member plus this kind of X factor of being a writer about, of art and culture and being a lover of art and artists, which most people on museum boards are. It's not what I want to say, but I spend a lot of time thinking very deeply and writing very deeply about these things that as a museum we have a different relationship with. And I think that's the kind of, plus one that I bring to that environment. And vice versa, when I'm writing about art and culture, I'm very well aware of the kind of power dynamics and institutions in the art world, like museums, bring to bear on the lives of artists, what they're able to do, who they're able to get in front of. And when I'm thinking about society, which I think probably cuts across all the work that I do, I'm also conscious of these power dynamics and how what museums do, what artists do, what gets written about, what gets hung on walls, who is sitting in the rooms deciding what gets hung on walls, all come to define us as a society, what we value, what we say has importance, the zeitgeist, right? So I'm aware of the interplay of all these things as much as I try to keep my roles and each one of them separate. But I do recognize that there's probably something interesting that I come to the table with because of the many hats.
Do you see yourself as like an outsider?
Always.
It was interesting. When I was in New York, I interviewed Ruby Lerner, which will be upcoming. But she talked about that. That's a really important role.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe even a step further, I would say like an interloper.
Interesting.
I really feel like I am not supposed to be where I am most of the time.
Yet you belong in the room.
Right. And I mean, I'm not uncomfortable with that. I mean, let me say this. If it's not because of my gender or my race, and actually, honestly, I'm over that too. I mean, I can channel... I can channel my frustration with that into something really powerful. I mean, I think when I was younger, I probably was more hurt by it. I don't mind not belonging. And again, I think there's an edge. There is a real power in that because I think people don't know what to do with you, or they think that they do, and they never do. And that kind of like the creep of the person who's there and you think you know what to do with them, and then they bring something. People are always surprised, and I like that.
That's amazing.
I like that. It keeps it interesting.
So then what brought you to writing?
That's a really good question because, I had a teacher in high school, Kay Patterson. We had the same last name of all things. And I remember one day in class, English class, she kind of screamed at me and said, if you would just shut up and write, you're such a good writer, you know what I mean? And I really remember that. I remember liking writing and like writing, but not, knowing that I was any good at it. And I liked how angry she was because it made me feel like there was more at stake maybe than I realized. I don't know that I would have described it that way then, but looking back on it, that definitely stood out. And then in college, I took a writing class with a woman, Quandra Prettyman at Barnard. I went to Columbia undergrad, and she was at Barnard anyways. She made me love the literature that made me want to reflect on paper, about what I was reading and experiences. It was like in the writing about the literature, it became another thing. It wasn't just reading the books, but like the reflecting and the writing about what I was reading became a whole other experience. I thought it was just in the reading of the books. And then I wound up interning at magazines and sort of being fascinated with the editorial world. And so I don't want to say that I fell into it because I was clearly like drawn into something that was there from very early on. And then I got lucky getting a job at Condé Nast Traveler magazine at the sort of last gasp heyday of magazines. And it was just so much fun. Writing, and worked in Times Square, Condé Nast does Vogue and Architectural Digest and GQ. I mean, it was just, I was rewarded for kind of following my nose. It was the first of many times, I think.
I would love to hear more about that. Was that your first editorial work?
Yes.
So cool.
Yes.
How was it for you? What was your big takeaway? How was your learning experience?
Yeah, I mean, I interned for Kim France, she was kind of a music journalist at the time. She wound up launching one of the most successful magazines, which is a shopping magazine of all things called Lucky Magazine. But she was like a real journalist, a real writer's writer. I mean, she just took it very seriously. So I interned with her when she was at Elle Magazine before I graduated from college. And so when I got to Condé Nast, it felt familiar enough. I wasn't totally intimidated by it because I had been working at a big publishing company before as an intern. But it was a travel magazine, and it was geared towards the wealthiest class of Americans. I was the only Black person on the editorial staff, and it was very alienating. That thing where I described feeling like an interloper then, it was not cool. But I had, again, a great boss, Peter Frank. The first piece he commissioned was like a 200-word thing, and he literally came out of his office after I submitted and was like, "You're a really good writer." Like, I think he was as surprised as I was like, wow.
Nice.
So I got that affirmation from people who were really good and took it seriously. And I learned a lot about good writing, the economy of words and thought, editorial, because every page is paid for by an advertiser. So there's no fat, there's no room for excess. So I learned how to like trim to the essence because every word cost, literally. We paid writers by the word, we printed by the word. There was a cost associated with every inch on the page. But it was a difficult environment to be in because I didn't see myself reflected in anything, in the stories, and like I was constantly fighting battles, indirect and direct. But at the same time, there were people who saw me and encouraged me, told me, you're good, you should keep going. And I took that away from it, that like I had something to work with.
What I'm hearing is that it is sort of a challenge to develop your own voice when you are in an environment where you have all of this sort of requirements, and when you're speaking from a certain position that goes with the magazine or with the already pre-existing tone of the place where you're at, which is interesting because one thing that we were talking about preparing the episode was about the many forms that your writing takes. And I was fascinated by the ways in which sometimes your writing has more of that documentary essay style, right? In your text, Blackwater River, which is incredibly fascinating, is about traveling. It's about traveling with a documentary film crew. So there is a sort of overlap between the documentary form and then the essay form. I think that is another moment where you wear a different hat and yet all sort of comes together and informs your writing and sort of shapes your voice. Could you tell us about this project?
Yeah, that was a really fascinating project. I mean, probably one of the more exciting things I've ever done. So basically, a producer who grew up in the Low Country, which comprises a part of Georgia and South Carolina, she came from South Carolina and she wanted to do a documentary about guns, about environmental degradation, and about domestic violence. And she basically wanted to take a look at 3 issues that were kind of driving news cycles and debates, very sort of hard news issues, but taking a very creative, almost kind of art house cinema, documentary cinema look at things. So the challenge was how you talk about these hot button issues in ways that are kind of artistic and creative and almost surreal without losing the sort of like teeth of the issues themselves, but coming at them in a way that's not so divisive. So she pulled together a kind of weird grouping of professionals. There was a still photographer, Robbie Lawrence, me as a writer, and I'd never written a film script before, a DP, and then a director who was her husband, and then she was a producer. And so we all went and stayed in a house together for 2 weeks and went out, and I conducted interviews of people on site. So we started in a domestic violence shelter. I interviewed women who were in a safe house. I interviewed shrimpers who, depended on the clean waters off the coast. I interviewed the queen of the Gullah Geechee, which are a native group living in the coast and off the islands. Anyway, just interviewing various people and various groups and, asking them questions about their experiences. I interviewed the mothers who had lost their children to gun violence. I interviewed people in churches. Anyway, and so the film itself was built from a combination of still images, moving images, and then pieces of interviews that I conducted. So the script that I produced was from splices of interviews put together. There was no narrator. It was only the voices of the people who I'd interviewed laid out over the moving and still images. And it was a short documentary film. I think it was less than 20 minutes, and it was called Protect. And it was about all the different ways, the protection that people find in gun ownership, the protection of the environment, women protecting themselves and their children from the violence of their partners. It was all the different ways that people in this very dynamic and interesting part of America were protecting themselves from real and perceived threats.
Wow. Yes, that is fascinating.
That sounds amazing. And what an ingenious thread, this idea of protection.
Yeah, the producer, she saw the through line. I mean, I have to admit, when she first threw those 3 subject matters on the table, I struggled to understand. But as I got into it, there are a lot of things, and that was really one of the more fascinating things about the experience of the film, which was we were implicated in it as documentarians. I mean, and maybe I don't work in film, so again, I don't know, maybe this happens to everybody who works in film, but as I was interviewing women in the safe house, I was understanding all of the dynamics of being in a safe house. I mean, I interviewed the director, and she said, nobody is in this safe house because of domestic violence alone. There's always some intersection of domestic violence and poverty, domestic violence and drug abuse, mental illness, racism. So understanding what I was looking for was being put in front of me as I was doing the thing. Interviewing a 12-year-old boy who had an arsenal of weapons in his backyard, and I so wanted him to be, evil. And he was just lovely. I mean, he was just lovely. I broke all the rules of journalism. The story's not about you. You know what I mean? In my question, I was you know what I mean? I just wanted to catch him, And I remember asking him, so if they ban gun ownership tomorrow in America, what are you going to do? And he was like, I play golf. You know what I mean?
Oh my God.
Lady, this is not that big of a deal. You need to chill.
I would just switch, right?
Yeah, just switch. Just play golf. It's not that big of a deal. It's not who I am. It's what I like to do. But, so it was a challenging project, but it was, there was the mechanics of being a part of a film, which I'd never done, but then the experience of learning about something that I knew nothing about, and maybe actually even worse, thought I knew a lot about and knew nothing about, and like adjusting my approach in real time so that it felt fair to the people who lent their time and their voices to the project.
I find it interesting that you convey this idea that it's extremely difficult to follow a certain narrative line, even formally, right? How you tell a story, how you narrate a story, when the story it's way more complex than you think or that is anticipated. And even in this case, with all of these different issues that the director wanted to address, these are not all discrete and fixed, but rather dynamic and overlapping and connected. So again, thinking about how all of this then transferred to your writing style, it's fascinating because you're constantly thinking about, how am I going to tell this story in a way that doesn't essentialize or that doesn't reduce the complexity of the issues I'm addressing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the people, everybody deserves to be complex.
Right. The individual stories.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that's what, a lot of the people that I write about have been, in one way or another, robbed of their humanity. And so the flattening of people is the way that happens.
Right.
And so my focus is on bringing the complexity that every human being deserves to be seen through back to people who have not been afforded it.
So staying with this idea of writing style and how it is, in a way, a struggle to develop a voice when your own experience is based on the voices of others and on trying to also give a voice to people who don't, but also based on this experience of traveling, of multilingualism that you inhabit. I'm fascinated by this, and I found particularly interesting and something that resonates with this is your text on transculturalism, which is one of the first ones that you published. And so writing this transcultural non-fiction travelogue, to me, speaks to this experience of developing a voice that's also informed by this traveling and by the encounter with others. And I particularly like this moment where you say, the other answer is that traveling and living abroad has become my journey into me. All kinds of people and places have left me with pieces of what I discovered I need in order to be me. I hope that I reciprocate, need to experience that connection both with people at home and with people all around the globe, both to have a more holistic view of the world and myself, but also because the variety of ways people eat, work, worship, suffer, and love inspire and fascinate me.
I like that.
So tell us a little bit about this. It's a little bit of biographical style of writing that sort of you make it your own, a kind of writing that is inherently transcultural and therefore reflects on transculturalism as a personal experience.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I wrote that so long ago. It's interesting to hear it again. I haven't read it in a very long time. It's interesting. Regardless of what the assignment is, because all of the writing that I've done so far, I've been given a prompt, and I'm very good at kind of like following orders in that sense. Like I'm very good at like put a task in front of me and I'm like a bit of a soldier, like, okay, here I go. But like, I'm probably not aware of these shifts that you're pointing out in voice and approach and energy, like how much of myself is revealed. I mean, clearly there's some essays where they're personal in nature, and this was one of them. But I allowed myself to kind of flow into a little bit of the sociology or the anthropology of being a human out in the world and kind of zooming in and out of my own experiences on like dance floors with French boys in Paris to like, what it means to be out in the world regardless of who you are. Like, I enjoy not having to be restricted by any genre when I'm writing because I'm constantly, like, it reflects the way my thinking goes. I can't help but think about the things that hang around my experiences. Like my life as a Black woman in America has been politicized, has been dissected. And that's what I do as I'm experiencing things, maybe not at the same time, but I'm constantly aware of these dynamics. Anyway, and so my writing tends to flow very much between perspectives and genres because that's how I live and that's how I think. Personal essays allow me to do that more than any other form. Some of my more traditional artist profiles, I do have more guardrails. But that kind of writing that I did in transculturalism is probably what I enjoy most doing. It probably scares me the most, but it's what I enjoy most doing.
But it's interesting because if you think about it, transculturalism is so much part of the Black experience. And yet, we usually think about it in terms of African American, right? Like African and then Americans. And there is this sort of back and forth between these two continents. But we know of the important presence of African Americans in Europe and the importance of African American culture in Europe. And I think your work really has been very much interested in carving out this history of transculturalism that has shaped the Black experience in America.
Well, that's really interesting. I don't know that I ever thought about it that way. I mean, I'm kind of interested in what I'm interested in, but it's interesting that you see that across the writing. I mean, I'm definitely interested in this, I am aware of, in sort of the African diaspora experience. And even when I say that, I just mean like what it means to be a Black body in the world, like moving around in the world. And I know that like African diaspora experience means certain things in different circles, like signals certain things. I mean it in a very basic lived way. Like I'm constantly interested in the interior experience of Black people wherever they are and how that translates into what they do with their lives, how the world receives them, what they're allowed to do, what they give themselves permission to do. I'm very interested in that interior-exterior relationship that Black people, that everybody experiences, but because I'm Black, this is what interests me the most.
But it totally reflects on all of your writing, even like your interest in fashion as a cultural expression of the African diaspora. These kinds of projects that you've worked on and all of the research you've done speaks to this interest in the sort of landscape of the African diaspora, but also the evolution of it, right? How it's transformed in all the different places and contexts where it has developed. So we wanted to hear more about this project. Yo, Adrienne, meet the knockout who scaled fashion's color barrier. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's about a couple of things. One, it's about this woman, Adi Fidelin, who was Man Ray's lover and muse between the wars. Basically, there's a photograph of hers that appeared almost by mistake in the September 1936 edition of Harper's Bazaar at a time when American fashion magazines basically had a ban on using Black models. So the hook for the story in journalistic terms was that she was the first Black model to appear in a major American fashion magazine. And the piece was about that, but in the course of writing that piece, I realized that there was, no biographical information was available about this woman. There were hundreds of photographs of her in the Centre Pompidou archive, the Man Ray archives at Centre Pompidou, but that nobody knew when she was born or where she came from, if she was still alive. Nobody seemed to care. And I thought, how does somebody so captivating and beautiful have such a rich photographic archive and then nobody really cares who she was? And that to me was just another form of violence committed against Black women by the archive, to use Saidiya Hartman's terms. So I was fascinated by the fact that nothing existed on this woman, and I felt that there was a deep injustice in that. So that article then springboarded into sort of a search for Adi and her story. So I was fascinated about that, how people get left off of the pages of history and then wanting to recover this one woman's story. But it was also consideration of what it meant and what it still means for fashion magazines, major fashion publications, to not use a diversity of models, because these publications are telling us, here's what's beautiful, here's what's fashionable, here's what's cool. But also, the people who are wearing these things, they represent our standards of beauty. And when you don't put anybody in there other than really skinny white women, all the things that happen from body dysmorphia to racist ideas about who's beautiful and who, it's just, I can't even imagine what the conversation was like in the art department. Why don't we use a Black model? No, we can't use Black models. They're all ugly. I don't even know, how do you even get your head around that? But then that this woman kind of slips in by mistake. She's captivating, blah, 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 blah. I mean, and it's not like she broke the color barrier. Like Harper's didn't start using black models after that. They went back to their usual practices. And so then it was a little bit of an indictment of the fashion industry in some senses, but also the fact that, this woman had just fallen off the pages of art history or cultural history and the injustice of that.
Well, this was really common, though. Like, you would have the famous man, and then it would be like, and woman or and wife, and that thing that's next to them, which we might need to acknowledge, maybe.
Yeah, and I would say that all muses, muses are kind of having a comeback now, and people are starting to reevaluate.
Yeah, because maybe they weren't muses, maybe they were partners.
Yes, exactly. And that's kind of what my research and my interest has become. These women as artists themselves using their own bodies.
100%.
Some of them literally had their own artistic practice. There are plenty of them. Lee Miller, Dora Maar, like whatever, go on and on. Addie was a dancer, for example. In most cases, these women actually were artists. But even if they weren't, the fact that you can inspire someone, not everybody can do that. There is an art to that. You are wielding something when you're able to do that has been underappreciated because basically women were the ones doing it.
I'm thinking also about fashion itself, and I'm thinking that exoticism, for example, was a way to make these altered bodies more acceptable as well, right? Like part of that language of fashion where the exotic and exoticism then becomes something of value to fashion because of its novelty, because of its shock value, because of its uniqueness, right? Also this stylization that comes with these forms of exoticism.
Yeah, and in fact, the image of Frida Lam that made its way into Harper's made its way because Paul Eluard, the surrealist poet, wrote a piece about the Congo to accompany an exhibition of hats from the Congo. And so Addie was sort of like the accessory,
right,
if you will, used to illustrate this piece. And she was wearing all these very African, she was from the island, she's from Guadeloupe,
right,
but she's wearing these very kind of stereotypical African bangles and ivory and whatever. I'm not an expert on fashion and fashion history, but absolutely the exotic and using women of color to underscore and heighten the element of the exotic that fashion depends upon to have a certain kind of appeal. Absolutely. Again, that is another form of the flattening that I was talking about. And Frida Lam actually, interestingly, played an extra in films and stuff, and she always kind of had this exotic role where she just sort of plugged into the other role, no matter what the geographic, specification of the movie was, the story, just let's slot her in there. She looks different. It's just lazy. Mm-hmm. It's just racist. It's just boring. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. But it says a lot about how we understand visibility because we often think, as soon as somebody sort of becomes visible, sort of occupies that place of representation, then we assume that something is happening in terms of ideologies are changing or cultural beliefs are changing, right? But then we see how the body sort of gets erased by the cultural artifact and the exotization of both, right? And there is a sort of erasure and invisibility even or actually because the body is put in this juxtaposition with the cultural artifact.
Yeah, it's like rendering invisible the visible by playing into things that exist before the person is in that space. You don't really see them.
Yeah.
You see something, but you don't see them. You don't see a person. You see a stereotype that has nothing to do with that person and what they bring to the screen, page, whatever.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. The subject is a function of the object, not the other way around.
Not the other way around.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so you were talking about how you were sort of uncovering a history, getting in there and completing a story that was incomplete. I'm so curious, why focus on art, architecture, and design so specifically?
Interesting. Yeah.
Like your projects like the African American Design Nexus Harlem Story Maps traces the neighborhood's Black designed places. It was fascinating. But why narrow in on art, architecture, and design?
Yeah, I wish I had a really great answer for that. I mean, I'm sort of a hired gun. Like, I had an editor at Kinfolk magazine who then went to work at Harvard Design magazine, and she called me and asked me to write for her there. And the reason why she wanted me to write for her there was because most of the contributors were architects, and they wrote these very technical pieces for other architects. And she thought that I could bring curiosity about the so what, the implications of design on society to the table in a very kind of pedestrian way, because I don't have the technical language to describe it in a complex architectural way, to make some of this stuff more appealing and translatable to an everyday reader. I'd never written about design and architecture before, but I had written a lot about society and thought a lot about society and art and culture and society. And she thought that it was just like adjacent. So she would call me with these stories, architects or designers, because I also wrote about landscape architects, graphic designers, industrial designers. Anyway, anybody who falls into the house of design. And the Harlem story map was one. But anytime somebody's work moved beyond just architecture for architecture's sake, or for the kind of design's sake, anybody who thought about their work in the context of society, she would call me to interview, which led to so many fascinating conversations. I mean, it's really a gift of an editor to be able to write a piece about something about which you know nothing.
Right. And that gets back to what you said before about the flow between perspectives, right?
Right.
You're kind of like mushing into anthropology and sociology, and you can kind of pull from this lived experience and then explore and interrogate through that, which is so fascinating.
I mean, I love writing those pieces. I'm asking, literally, like, what does that mean? I have to do a little more research before the stories, but it definitely pushes me to think about things critically that I've always taken for granted. That buildings are political.
Always.
Like,
how big is that front door?
And of course they are now. Like, I can see that, but like, I never thought about that. You know what I mean? Like, public spaces, parks. I interviewed a Mexican architect who worked primarily in domestic spaces, and she was thinking about how in Mexico, domestic labor is supposed to be sort of felt but not seen. So you step into somebody's home and you know that it's clean, but you don't see the staff that keeps it clean. You don't see the vacuum cleaners and like the sponges. And so she thought about designing a house where you could actually see the labor that kept the house functioning, because what was happening is that people were not taking into account in urban planning the fact that there was a whole domestic class who couldn't afford to live in the neighborhoods of the people whose homes they were cleaning, but they'd have to travel. But there was no public transportation servicing these wealthy neighborhoods, which was putting the women, primarily women who were working in these homes, at risk. So because they weren't seen in the homes, they weren't seen in society, they weren't considered in urban planning, they were literally being put in physical danger going to and from work every day. Or bus service would stop before, their shifts would finish. So anyways, she was very concerned, again, with design and how it leaves from domestic spaces and influences the world outside, including the people who are living in the society. I mean, it's just mind-blowing, critical, mind-blowing work.
Amazing. And it's interesting, too, that you bring all of these experiences into your other work, like your advocacy work and your board work. So I have to admit something. I mean, we use this podcast sometimes like, hey, I don't really know this. So we get to ask all the dumb questions, like asking for a friend, right? I don't really know what trustees on boards do. So you're on the Phillips Collection board, but what does that mean?
In layperson's terms, it means that you're kind of responsible for making sure that the museum is moving in the right direction. The director reports to the board of trustees. We're responsible for like the financial stability of the institution, policy setting, hiring the director, approving of acquisitions and deaccessioning that the curatorial team puts together for our consideration. Yeah, we manage the institution. And, I've only been on one board and I've only been on one museum board, so I can't really compare to the experience. I know that different museum boards function differently, but the Phillips Collection board is a very active board. We're about 35 people right now.
Is that big?
I think it's on the larger side, but it's not, bloated.
Because that's not a big museum.
No, it's not, yeah.
That's not like a giant footprint. So that's a lot of voices in the room.
Yeah, and I think that, not everybody is a voice. Some people are there to write a check. Some people are there to bring their voice to bear. Some people are there to bring their connections to bear. I mean, everybody comes with something different. And so it's not literally like 36 people weighing in on like, are we going to deaccession this one piece of art? That's not really the way that it works. Most of the work of a board happens in committees. That's really where the fun happens, so that they're smaller subsets of trustees who get together around areas of interest and expertise. And then decisions are made in committee that are then passed on to the full board for adoption or what have you. And at that point, I wouldn't say that it's sort of a formality, but very rarely does something that's been decided and hashed out in committee get sort of rejected and sent back. But it's a very democratic, it's a very collaborative, it's a collective love of the institution project. I mean, there's really no other reason why you would give money and time unless you believed in the importance of the institution. And I mean, I'm not here to sell anybody on the Phillips Collection, but it's a magical museum in the Washington, D.C. landscape. It offers something very specific in the intimacy and the urgency, I think, that the shows and the programming bring. That's very special. That's very special.
Yeah. One thing I really appreciated was your website was really generous. Like, it kind of acts as an archive, and it makes all of your work publicly available. Did you find that it reaches a wider audience beyond those that regularly read the publications you write for?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, most of the magazines that I write for, most of the work is behind a paywall. And so I ask to have the PDFs of my pieces. Most of them ask me to wait for a certain amount of time post-publication to put them on the site, and I'm happy to do that. But it's important to me that the writing is accessible. I mean, the other hat that I wear, my sort of day job, is I work in communications for globally engaged organizations. And I'm always telling my team, look, it's like if the tree falls in the forest and nobody's around, does it make a sound? If I write something and nobody reads it, it's like it's never been written. I really don't care. I never read my work after it's written. I never do. I write it for other people. I don't write it for myself. The writing is what I do for myself, but the reading of it is for other people. I'll say two things. I mean, to answer your question directly, like, I know that it reaches a broad range of people because people contact me through the website all the time. And that's really wonderful. I get emails from artists. Those are my favorites. Artists who want me to write about their work, who say, like...
Those are I was like, oh, she gets us.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like they see me as a custodian and that they feel like their stories, their work would be safe in my hands. I mean, I'm not for everybody, but the artists who do feel that reach out to me. That means a lot to me. I've gotten some incredible letters from other writers as well. And I'll say the other sort of slightly selfish purpose that it serves is to remind me that I'm a writer. I don't go back and read my stuff, but I have times because I spend so much of my time doing other things. But when I go to that site and I can scroll, I can say, I did something. Like, I can't forget because I can forget. But when I'm there, I can't deny people have given me space for my words, which means that it's worth it. I'm worth it. I should keep going, so it does serve that purpose for me personally.
I think there's a little bit of an act of rebellion there because you are sharing with people something that, again, usually accessible only through paid subscriptions. And then also because the work that usually writers do as commission imply a little bit of a removal from a more personal perspective, try to be more objective in conveying information. And I think that your insistence in this weaving together your own personal experience, your own views, I think something there is the work of a maverick a little bit.
I love that idea. Well, I used to think that the only way to insert yourself was through the first person, but that's actually not true at all. What I choose to share and the way that I present it is unique. That's my point of view coming to bear on the subject matter, right? Like, you can look at a biography of an artist in Wikipedia. What purpose do I serve, right? But I'm cherry picking details to give you an appreciation from what I see as being important, not just to the artist. That's the most important thing, is that they see themselves seen. Like, my nightmare is to have an artist read a profile and be like, that's not me. But that like what I want us to take away. So like I want to do right by the artist and their vision and their intention, but I want us to learn something. And that's how I insert, like I'm saying, don't look over here, look over here. And that's where my voice and my presence plays out. Like that's how I exert my influence. And that way, yes, I love the idea of being a maverick.
And it's back to that sort of interior exterior, right? Like you're in your essays, like I think it was the Deborah Roberts one. I saw her in a new way. Just that
great.
little subtle lens shift, like sharing a little bit of her anxiety, sharing a little bit about her workaday, sharing a little bit about when she leaves work and how she leaves work, and then how she picks it back up again.
Yes.
I was like
Yes.
right there. I felt like I was sitting next to her.
That makes me so happy because the hardest profiles to write are about the artists who've been written about a lot, right? Because like, what else is there to say? So I make a point of never reading or just skimming a little bit. But my goal in every interview is to have the person say, nobody's ever asked me that question before. That's when I know that I've done a really good interview.
But I think that's also like your sort of outsider viewpoint, right? That you're not entrenched in this art world, right? That this isn't this isn't where your day job is, so to speak. Also the multilinguist in you.
And also the journalist, because the academic writing is very different, and there is a benefit and an advantage to coming from the journalistic experience, because you're documenting, you're recording, and that is very valuable information, but also told and shared in a way that relates a lot more to the senses, to the moment, right? Can convey more the actual experience of being in the presence of an artist.
I'm learning so much.
All right, last question. I wanted to dip in on your Hot Shoe Magazine article. These were great. I loved these. But in your essay, Hoarding the Porto Novo Night, you wrote these lines, and they really struck me. The fever dream lasted as long as we stayed inside, as long as the DJ gave us a reason to stay upright and stepping, as long as we believed that one more memory could be created. I was struck by the idea of the passion driving action. And I felt that in your essay, but I also feel that in your work, that your passion drives your sense of choice of subjects. And I just wanted to kind of dip into that for a minute about how you decide what to write about. Like you've said that you're a gun for hire here, but there is a direction to your body of work.
Yeah, I mean, I want my work to mean something. I want my work to like be pushing needles and conversations in what I feel are challenging but important directions. Like I want us to be better versions of ourselves. And I want my writing to play some like teeny tiny part in that process. Like what are we here for if not that? And so I don't come to it like I'm going to tell you a pretty story. I want you to get something. I want you to understand something. I want you to be challenged in a way that pushes you to think about better ways of doing and thinking and being. And so the passion is about a belief. There's an optimism in that things can be better, that we can be better, that we can do better. And that through understanding certain things, we can't turn away from the work. And so I think artists are, even if just through providing us with a kind of what I can only describe as a kind of magical beauty art, showing us that like we should aspire to beauty and goodness and great, like we should aspire to this kind of divine, and they are sort of pulling it out of the sky and putting it in front of us. And like, why not be the best version of yourself? They're pulling the best that exists out of the ether and putting it in front of us. And like, even if I'm just celebrating that to me is an act of something that means something. So the passion comes from that belief. And let's just get this a little bit more right tomorrow than we did today. That's exciting to me. It's vital to me. And it's what I bring to like every single piece, everything that I try to do with my time and with my days. And I hope that's infectious, you know? I hope that I can convince, not that everybody needs convincing, not that I'm the only one out there doing that. But anyways, I hope that I'm bringing that kind of energy to conversations where it might not so obviously live.
That's powerful. That's a powerful way to end our episode.
Well, thank you.
So this brings us to the end of today's episode, and we just want to go straight into our final question. Our listeners might know this by now, but we have a question that we bring back for each guest. And Sala, feel free to be as expansive as you want. It's very open-ended. But here's the question. What project would you do if you had unlimited funding and time?
Yeah, gosh, there's so many. I've always wanted to do a sort of intergenerational exploration through the matrilineal line through my mother's side of the family. So from my great-grandmother to my grandmother to my mother to me, they're like real leaps in. I think a class lens is one way of looking at it, but we had very unique experiences, but that are all linked one to the next, to the next, to the next. And so trying to find the through lines, like what we each take forward and, you know, this kind of liberation that was allowed based on social and political and economic progress, just like, you know, where I come from and what I'm working with from what's been given to me, what's been passed along. I would love to be able to sit down and really celebrate the women in my family and trace something between the woman that I see myself as and what these women before me were.
Amazing. I want to read it.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So we want to wrap up with some thank yous. Sala, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. We really appreciate you being our fantastic guest.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. It really has been.
Thank you to Sky Park Tosig, our wonderful producer. Thank you to Taras Matla here at the University of Maryland, our gallery. And thank you to Jonathan Furmansky for the great music that we have the pleasure to enjoy. Thank you to our listeners, and again to Sala for speaking with us today. We will be back in 2 weeks here in the Art Equation. Bye.
Bye.
We are The Art Equation. You can find us wherever you listen every other Thursday.
Thanks for being here with us. We'd really love to hear your thoughts. So please subscribe. And if you have a moment to leave a review, it really helps us out. We love the feedback. Talk to you soon here on The Art Equation. The Art Equation is a podcast from Now Be Here with support from the University of Maryland Art Gallery. Now Be Here is a directory and resource created by and for women and non-binary artists. You can find more information at www.nowbehereart.com.